This is the sort of video that gets you demonetized, but the good thing is I was never monetized in the first place, so I guess I get to do this, at least until Israel forces YouTube to take down all criticism of its government. So let's see what the ever-reliable and unbiased Israel Defense Force has to say for itself. Here's some convenient propaganda for you to excuse the violations of human rights and international law at our hands. Hamas has turned residential areas in Gaza into military strongholds. Hamas fires rockets at Israel from densely populated neighborhoods in Gaza like these. The IDF must strike these rocket launchers in order to prevent Hamas from firing more rocket launchers at Israel. Meanwhile, over 360 of Hamas's rockets have already misfired and landed short in these same civilian neighborhoods. Now these are the types of statements that are really controversial and get you demonetized, but I'm just gonna come out and say it. Violence is bad and Hamas is bad. No fucking shit. The rockets Hamas fires at Israel are unguided. They basically point in a general direction and fire away. Every single rocket Hamas fires is technically a war crime. I'm not here to defend Hamas, I'm here to point out Israel's obvious deflections and lies. First of all, note that they started at Hamas's rockets, completely ignoring the context before, like the impending evictions at Sheikh Jarrah and the storming of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and before that allowing Hamas to take power by repeatedly rejecting peace deals and making it all but clear they would never stop until all of Palestine's lands were conquered. It's classic brinksmanship, like some kid telling a joke so that all those kids who laugh get in trouble. But notice how they excuse their own actions by redirecting attention toward Hamas. Gaza is a densely populated region, about 5,000 people per square kilometer. That's denser than cities like Seattle or Detroit. You'd be hard-pressed to find areas not occupied by civilians. Their mentioning of Hamas rockets misfiring is a complete red herring. Their argument is basically, well, Hamas did it so we can too, right? Not that it matters, you clearly don't mind targeting civilians like these two high-ranking doctors who were vital to a main hospital that was already understaffed and undersupplied. Casually targeting a highway leading to a hospital? That doesn't sound like genocide at all. And why were the hospitals undersupplied in the first place? Because of Israel's blockade. It's really human rights violations all the way down. I could go on about things like how they bombed UN schools despite all UN schools being clearly marked with a UN flag, but you get the point, or deliberately choose not to. Hamas is an expansive network of underground tunnels that Hamas digs under the border to try to infiltrate into Israel and kidnap Israelis. Yeah, there's no evidence any Israeli, let alone any Israeli civilian, has been kidnapped using these tunnels. Tunnels that Hamas operatives use to maneuver around Gaza. Yeah, that's what tunnels generally are for. What's next? Are you gonna accuse Palestine's military of having guns? It's also very funny of Israel to accuse others of terrorism and illegally crossing borders when they're the ones murdering civilians by the dozens and illegally occupying the entire West Bank. Both are legitimate military targets. See the bait and switch here? They're talking about the rockets and the underground tunnels, but they use that to apply to the civilian murders as well. This is the entrance to a tunnel in Gaza, and one block over is a kindergarten and a mosque. Well, if they're so tightly packed, maybe you'd think twice about being that guy who looks at the terrorist who's taken a bunch of hostages and says, blow them up. All of them, especially when you're using munitions you know have a likely kill radius of 50 to 150 meters. Hamas uses multi-story buildings all over Gaza for multiple military purposes, including intelligence gathering, planning attacks, command and control, communications. Unfortunately, other units in the buildings are often used by civilians who may or may not know what's going on down the hall. But when Hamas uses a building for military purposes, the building becomes a lawful military target. Now, if you don't recognize that building, multiple media outlets including Al Jazeera and the Associated Press operated out of there, at least until Israeli airstrikes killed it to death. But what evidence did the IDF provide this building also housed Hamas militants? They highlighted it in red? The AP has denied Hamas were in there, and they certainly wouldn't risk their journalists in that way. US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken hasn't seen any evidence of Hamas there either. The IDF did call the building, telling all inhabitants they had an hour to evacuate, so they weren't there to kill anybody. But let's take a look at other things the IDF supposedly wants the building to stop. Intelligence gathering, command and control, communications? Those sound like the sorts of things journalists might also use such a building for. And 1 hour clearly isn't enough for the media to evacuate their computers, paperwork, and equipment.
We need 10 minutes. As you can see, they're all around me. The press, not people who are going in to get weapons out.
So, bombing media headquarters, which just so happens to cripple their ability to report further, and using alleged Hamas militants as an excuse without providing any evidence, very convenient and not press intimidation at all. It just so happens the collateral damage, doctors, schools, and now this, all play vital functions for a prosperous society. What's more, they say this building becomes a lawful military target, no other qualifications required, which means if they wanted to, they could totally bomb the building without warning with everyone inside it, and later on say Hamas was in there as an excuse knowing that all the evidence was destroyed. What they're saying here is, we could totally kill you indiscriminately, but aren't you glad we didn't? Wink. Then they go on to say that Hamas's tactic is to maximize the damage when the IDF strikes them. Why? So the international community can step in and do absolutely nothing? And if that's really their strategy, why would you oblige them by playing straight into their hands unless you want Hamas in power so that you can continue justifying your attacks on Palestine? And boxed right there in bold letters, for Hamas an Israeli death is more valuable than a Palestinian life. Yup. They're basically like orcs from Lord of the Rings. And then the final lie, the IDF will continue to take as many precautions as possible to avoid civilian casualties. But on the contrary, if you really wanted to reduce civilian casualties, you would broker a peace deal. You have all the power here, you have the United States behind you, and you are winning this conflict. You could easily negotiate a peace deal with favorable terms, but you choose not to. Why? Because you're a fascist, and fascists thrive off of conflict. Ya boy Benjamin Netanyahu was facing a breakdown in his coalition as well as prosecution over fraud, so he had to do something to unite the country, and what better way is there to do that than to start a war? And to start a war, you need an enemy to fight against. So the Palestinians it is, so you go and provoke them into an attack, and here we are. Netanyahu is an ethno-nationalist who has made it clear he will not stop until the Palestinian people are destroyed. Hamas is Israel's mirror ideology, but only one of these two parties has the ability to eradicate the other. No Palestinian is safe as long as Israel exists in its current form. Nobody knows what the right solution is, but what we can do now is to pressure our sorry excuse for our President Joe Biden to cancel his newly approved $700 million arms deal with Israel, cut off all aid to that scumfuck country, and threaten economic sanctions if it does not cease fire immediately. But alas, that's nowhere near as easy as it should be, because doing so would basically be like telling America to stop being America. So fuck Hamas, fuck America more, and absolutely fuck Israel off the face of this goddamn earth.
I'm and I approve this message.